Welcome everybody to the Healing Connections podcast. I'm your host, Emmy Vadnais, and I'm an occupational therapist who specializes in integrative health, wellness and prevention, spirituality and intuition. And this is a place where we come together to talk about the evolution and the transformation of healthcare and your own personal health and well-being, and all the way to the health of the planet and maybe even beyond. And today we have the great honor to speak with Dr. Dean Radin about science, magic, and intuition. And Dean is the chief scientist at the Institute of Noetic Sciences and associated distinguished professor of integral and transpersonal psychology at the California Institute of Integral Studies and the president of the Parapsychological Association. He has his MS in electrical engineering and a PhD in psychology. Before joining the research staff at IONS in 2001, he held appointments at AT&T Bell Labs, Princeton University, University of Edinburgh, and SRI International. He is the author or co-author of hundreds of technical and popular articles, 4 book chapters, and 4 popular books that I am a big fan of: The Conscious Universe, Entangled Minds, Supernormal, and his latest book, Real Magic. So welcome, Dean. Thank you so much for joining us here today.
Happy to be here.
Yay. All right. Great. Well, thank you. We'll just dive right in here with the first question, which I'm sure you're asked a fair amount. How did you become interested in researching psi phenomena, which you've been doing for, is it 4 decades now?
Yeah, a little over 4 decades, which is shocking to me as time passes faster and faster, it seems. Well, like a lot of geeky kids, I was always interested in science fiction and science, comic books, fairy tales, that whole genre of material. And in the process, when you read that, you, of course, even as a child, recognize that it's fantasy. But to me, it always felt like it was slightly more than fantasy. Like it was like mythology portrays stories, truths about reality through story. And maybe something like that was going on with these stories as well. And of course, we know that a lot of times science fiction is a forecast of what science will eventually catch up to. So psychic phenomena are a staple theme in science fiction and comic books, and we see it now saturates the entertainment world. And I always wondered, well, is that just wish fulfillment or fantasy, or is there something real to it? And then when I was about 12, I found a book on parapsychology, which really caught my attention, because now it was saying that through the process of science, which is the best method that we've developed so far for discovering what's real, that some of these effects indeed were true. Well, at that point, I was basically hooked.
Well, I think that that's something that as humans, which you study, and we're going to talk a bit about, well, this is all in the realm of consciousness, that a lot of us do have these sort of questions and wonder, you know, what is real, what's not real. So you had this interest and you've done this now for many years. I don't know if you had this originally, but as you've gone or even today, what is your hope or intention with studying this?
I think this is part of the scientific credo, in a sense, that it is better to know than not to know. So I've always wanted to know everything. This is one of the problems with really enjoying school, because I liked every topic. You could open the encyclopedia at any point and become fascinated by everything. So of the various kinds of things that I've studied in some detail, psychic phenomena has been the biggest draw for me, because it's talking about not just a basic human experience, but one that's experienced by a lot of people. A large majority of people have experiences of this type. And from a scientific perspective, we have almost no understanding of what it is at all. It challenges our understanding of physics, understanding of consciousness, of who we are, of our role in the universe. All kinds of things are challenged by these phenomena. And at the same time, almost nobody is studying it. And so from a sociological perspective, it becomes interesting that here you have a very common thing, which is a multi-billion-dollar industry in entertainment, is pushed out on the far fringe as far as science is concerned. And that didn't make any sense to me. One way I put this is that if you want to get a PhD in popular culture, which a lot of people do, you can get a doctorate in Buffy the Vampire Slayer. Like you would have a dissertation with the title of something like the hermeneutics of Buffy the Vampire Slayer and its relationship to modern violence or something like that. So that's acceptable. It's not acceptable to do anything beyond studies of the belief of psychic phenomena. Like you can't talk about this even in a historical sense, or even as a historian of religion, to suggest that the kinds of stories that the Bible is saturated with are actually true. So I always thought, well, that is very, very strange. That tells me that there's basically a taboo. It's a social taboo that says there are certain things you don't want to talk about. And for me, at least, that just makes it more curious.
Yeah, and we're definitely going to get into our conversation here today about what you mentioned. It is very fascinating, and there's many factors, as we'll talk about, that there can be all these great comic book series and superhero stories, but yet in our own just day-to-day activities, which clearly people are interested in this, as you and I are, there hasn't really been a methodological way of how can we get this to the masses so that more people can, to whatever level we're able to be our own superheroes, if you will. So what has surprised you the most in the 4 decades of researching these topics?
Part of it is simply the resistance. This is mostly among scientists and primarily, I guess, the academic world. When you're going through a scientific curriculum, you're taught again and again, and this is actually true for anybody in the academic world, that there's academic freedom. It's part of the whole idea of academia that you're able to responsibly study anything that you wish. And I learned pretty quickly that that's simply not true. So we're being taught something that is not true, and generations are taught the same thing. And since I had been reading something about parapsychology by the time I was in college, I had read quite a bit. I noticed that the psychology textbooks that I had were uniformly saying that people believe and report in things like extrasensory perception, but there's no evidence for it. So on the one hand, you have college textbooks to the present day saying there's no reason to believe in any of this. It's all fraud or fantasy. And on the other hand, you have a ton of books and articles. And now, of course, I have also 40 years of experience in the laboratory saying what those textbooks are saying is not true, demonstrably not true. So that's one thing that I've always been disappointed with, that when you're dealing with a taboo, it's an uphill struggle. In some respects, I don't care too much, because if I really cared a lot, I wouldn't be doing this kind of research. Anybody who really wants to go with the status quo will find it a much more comfortable route. But I was just drawn by curiosity. And by the way, I wasn't pushed into this field due to personal experiences, or to experiences that people in my family reported. No one ever talked about this topic. But since I studied many, many different fields, I found that this one was the most curious because of the reasons that I've already said, that it's curious on almost every dimension you can imagine. So this is what has sustained my interest for so many years.
Well, thank you so much for all that you've done. It's certainly, I know I actually have a bachelor's. I double majored when I went to school for OT and got a degree in psychology, which has been a very interesting process, because I thought, well, maybe someday I'll become a psychologist, but I've learned that I can do a lot of mind, body, spirit work in my role as an occupational therapist. But in that training, I don't believe, and you've already said this too, that I don't believe we were taught about these experiences, these phenomena. And if it was touched on, which maybe it was maybe given a paragraph or two and sort of just set aside. And I've always been intrigued with it. I certainly have had personal experiences. I know I read in your book, Supernormal. We've got that when I was a child, that I did have a parent, and actually both parents, but one more than the other, who really spoke a lot about, even shared a past life experience, and even we would play with cards to try to test our ESP and things like that. And so it really did open me to that. And then with other experiences, it did, you know, like with you, it sounds like you were interested, you wanted to know everything and understand really the reaches and what are we capable of. And so I'm just curious so I know that in your literature, you talk a lot about psi, PSI. Can you share how is that like an abbreviation for psychic, or how did that become the term or a term?
So because parapsychology in popular culture anyway has a connotation of the occult and of negative connotation generally, many euphemisms have been developed over the years. Sometimes the euphemism was to help clarify the nature of the phenomenon. So way back in the late 1800s, people were studying thought transference. After a while, it became clear that it wasn't that thoughts, literally thoughts, were being sent from one person to the other. So the term thought transference turned into telepathy, because telepathy is a better description of the nature of the phenomenon. Namely, tele meaning at a distance, empathy meaning emotion or feeling, because that's generally the kind of thing that seems to be, it's not, sending is not the right word, but it's about, you're feeling somebody's emotion at a distance. So that's where telepathy comes from. The same is then true for many other phenomena. That clairvoyance, for example, means clear seeing. That's not exactly what it is. It's perceiving through space and time. Is probably a better neutral description. So new terms have been developed over the years as we gained better ideas about what the phenomena were. But also euphemisms were developed, like remote viewing as a popular term. It's exactly the same meaning as clairvoyance, but it was developed because this was being done under the auspices of a US government contract, and it was very close to an already existing term, namely remote sensing. So remote sensing is what you do when you have a satellite looking at the Earth. It is remotely sensing various kinds of variables on the ground. And so remote viewing sounded like that, and it made it possible then to get government grants without raising eyebrows, which is important. You will now find terms like anomalous cognition, which sounds more scientific and maybe neutral, and even more euphemistic terms. Every time a euphemism is developed, it has more and more syllables to it, and it sounds more and more scientific. And it's done strategically to get away from the popular idea about what these phenomena are. So psi was developed in thinking around the 1930s, PSI. It's the first letter of the Greek word psyche. And that's all it is. It is a stand-in for any kind of psychic phenomenon. And there were two flavors of psi. There's psi kappa and psi gamma. Again, just completely arbitrary terms for perceptual psi versus more action-oriented psi. But those psi kappa and gamma, nobody knows about that anymore. So just the term psi is used as shorthand.
Well, again, thank you so much for all that you've contributed. And that's a great summary of the word psi. And I tend to use the word intuition a fair amount, just because that's what the folks who have trained me. So maybe I will adopt that term more as I go on. You mentioned about the resistance in the scientific and academic world. And again, I want to thank you for your perseverance with that. Are you seeing that things are beginning to change in that arena, or what keeps you going despite some of this resistance?
Well, I think anybody who persists in an area that is not mainstream has a streak of rebelliousness, and for me, the resistance actually encourages me even more. And this would not be the case, for example, if I had done experiments and they uniformly are just not working. You'd have to be crazy to keep persisting, but that's not the case. We see that they're actually very interesting results. They're not very well understood, but that only makes it more interesting. We're onto something, we're not quite sure what it is yet. So That said, if you look in terms of the number of laboratories and the number of people who are doing this kind of work around the world, there clearly is some kind of a cyclic structure going on. So the one that's most easily seeable is in the 1960s and 70s, the so-called psychedelic 60s. There were many people, many laboratories, a fair amount of funding for this kind of research. Then there was a retraction after the abuses of psychedelics in the 60s and 70s. It was pushed back very hard by the government, the 80s, 90s, 2000s, and it severely reduced the popular interest in things like exploring inner space and exploring altered states of consciousness. And not surprisingly, funding went down, so the number of laboratories and people went down too. And so that was the down cycle. We are now very clearly on an up cycle. And you can see this in multiple ways. You see it because psychedelic research is now becoming more popular again. It's now recognized, I think, pretty clearly that calling any kind of psychedelic a Schedule I drug, which made it very difficult to do tests, was a vast overreaction. I mean, government is always reactive, but that was like crazy reactive. So there are a lot of positive things about psychedelics when they're used in the right context. At the same time, what we're seeing, which is slightly different than the 1960s and 70s, is that meditation now has become mainstream. It's no longer a fringe thing that only hippies did. It's mainstream, and like my healthcare provider is Kaiser, and so Kaiser pays for lessons in meditation because there's a lot of research now showing that it has positive health benefits. So you have a number of things that are becoming mainstream, which say that it's okay to study things having to do with mind, deep mind, consciousness, and you are beginning to see more and more conferences and university centers devoted to the study of consciousness. So you put all of that together, suddenly psychic phenomena are still fringe, but much, much closer to the center. So more funding is happening, more invitations to talk to scientific conferences, and this is true worldwide. So this cycle is it's not exactly a cycle that goes always exactly the same way. It's more like a cycle that's trending upwards. And so the hope is that there will invariably another cycle down at some point, but it won't go down as far as it did before. And eventually we're moving in some kind of upwards evolution.
Fantastic. I think it's really interesting about, well, I'm glad to hear that because of what I'm interested in and have definitely felt in a lot of ways on the fringe, and I think I have been. You mentioned about the government with not supporting this in, like, I think you said the 70s or 80s. And what was interesting is that simultaneously, and we don't need to talk too much about this, but I believe you were involved with some projects with the government with remote viewing. Do you want to take a moment and anything you're comfortable sharing about that, which has now, I believe, been declassified?
Yeah, the program was known by many different code words, now most commonly by the last code word, which was Stargate. It was funded mostly by the Defense Intelligence Agency and many other agencies over 20 years. This was during the 60s and 70s, actually went on until the middle of 1990. But during the 60s and 70s, it was very highly classified, even though in popular culture, it was already something that people were talking about. But because this was within an intelligence or government context, the point of it was to see if clairvoyance could be used for espionage. And of course, they called it remote viewing. Well, the answer is yes, it could, and that's why it persisted for 20 years and was used by many, many different agencies. And one of the ways, besides the statistics and all the rest, one of the ways of showing that it was valuable to the government was a number of times that the different agencies would come back to the operational side of the house. And these were highly talented remote viewers doing missions. They came back, in some cases, over 100 times. So this shows that just like a review of a restaurant on Yelp, if you have a lot of people coming back again and again and saying this is pretty good, that's saying something is going on. So there are many, many repeated customers from government agencies that were requesting additional information that could only have been obtained through clairvoyance. In many cases, I should say, though, that an intelligence agency never relies on one source. It's too risky to do that. So remote viewing information was one of many sources that would be used for a mission. And if it turned out to be valuable in terms of helping the mission, then of course they would come back later for more. And that's generally how it ended up being used.
Mm-hmm. Fascinating. And also SR International, that's an acronym. Can you share what that stands for?
It's SRI International.
I'm SRI, excuse me.
Yeah, so up until around 1970, it was Stanford Research Institute.
Okay.
So it was the Stanford University's commercial research side. And then in the 70s, when the anti-war demonstrations were getting hot, Stanford University separated from that institute. So it became a new name, SRI International. And that's what it was.
And you were doing similar research at this organization?
Well, I was part of the program, which was headquarters at SRI International.
Okay, I see. So again, I'm grateful for your, I guess we could call it your rebellious, or you called it your rebellious streak.
Yeah, I just noticed that the bottle I'm using here says Rebel.
Oh.
It's just a drink. It's like a chocolate drink, but I just noticed when I held it up there, I said, oh, that's funny.
That would be synchronicity, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that happens a fair amount to me. Does that happen to you very often?
Yeah, I've had some pretty strange synchronicity experiences.
Yeah, if you want to share one with us at one point, that'd be fun to hear. Well, we just had one right there.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering if your latest book, Real Magic, is clearly there's a lot of wonderful scientific data in here. But as far as the rebellious streak, do you feel like you were just saying, hey, I think you mentioned that you realized that you were really studying magic, and then you put this book out. So, and one of the things that you share in there is that magic has been with humanity for thousands of years, and then has really gone underground in, would you say, like the last 100 to 200 years? And why is this? And why are we now, I think you've described a little bit, but was it underground, or why are some people so afraid of it? And how is it coming back up again? Or maybe, with these other terms you've described?
Well, if you go from shamanism to today, so this is within known history, roughly 10,000 years. I mean, there's evidence now that humanity has been around for much, much longer than that, but known history. At every point in history, humans, being curious creatures, create cosmologies. This is the story of what the universe is and who we are and our relationship to it and so on. Up until scientific times and the Enlightenment in the 1700s, these were mythologies. They're basically stories. Of course, today too, like the idea of a Big Bang, for example, that's a story. We don't know that it's true. We have some evidence that something like that happened, but it's a story. We tell ourselves theories, which are stories, some of which have some evidence and others don't have much evidence to it. So if we go back far enough in history, in pre-scientific times, all we had were stories, because we didn't have methods yet other than through just daily experience to figure out how things worked. So this was a time where magic reigned supreme, because if somebody saw a lightning bolt, they came up with a story, which is essentially a magical story of a being in the sky who was throwing electricity or something. Of course, they didn't know about electricity either. But nevertheless, there were practices that developed based on the cosmologies. And so if we can skip over from, well, actually, we don't need to, from shamanism was very deeply involved in magic, because through trial and error, they discovered that certain things work certain ways. People would drink a certain kind of a vine in the Amazon, which is ayahuasca, and they would reach a different state of consciousness that gave them information. So the mystics and shaman would come out with information about how the world worked, and they would develop practices based on that information, and that was the original magic. Mm-hmm. And this persisted then all the way up to the present day, the same kind of thing, where through trial and error, mystics said, I have this download saying that the world is a certain way. That's a worldview. Within those worldviews, there are practices that developed. And so one of the reasons why I decided to write about magic is because in my previous book called Supernormal, I was studying what amounts to the Eastern esoteric literature, which has to do with yoga and meditation. And so this one's about the Western esoteric traditions. And all of those traditions can be summarized in 3 words. The cosmology says that consciousness is fundamental, that the most fundamental thing in the universe, and in fact, the thing that gives rise to the universe, is consciousness. So from that perspective, suddenly what mystics talk about and psychic phenomena and even magical practices suddenly become completely understandable, because the consciousness we're talking about is partially human consciousness, but it really is universal consciousness. It's as though the universe is saturated with some kind of primordial substance that is aware, that's highly reactive to intention, to emotion, to belief, to all the things we know as humans. And then from that gives rise to our fundamentals of physical reality, space-time, matter, and energy. So from that perspective, then we can understand why magic works. Your intention manifests things because that's what consciousness does. It's not, our ability to do it is not the same as the level of a universal consciousness. I can't create a planet just by wishing it so, but I can create very small effects because comparatively, I have only a little tiny piece of consciousness in here. At the same time, the consciousness that you and I are enjoying at the moment are identical to the universal consciousness. This is part of this long esoteric tradition. That's what it says again and again and again, very many different contexts and language and so on. It's also the basis of most religions. And so the way I would put it then is this, that when you think of worldviews, you have an esoteric worldview, you have a scientific worldview. And the scientific worldview, technology is the application of scientific theory, where technology is the application of the scientific worldview. We have lots of reasons to believe that the worldview is correct because our technologies are pretty good. Magic, or at least magical practice, is the application of the esoteric worldview. So now the question is, well, is the esoteric worldview correct? We know that the scientific worldview is pretty good, but is the esoteric worldview just ancient stories or not? Well, what we're taught as scientists is, yeah, it's all pre-scientific stories, basically. None of it is true. Except there's a big problem with that, in that we can use the tools of science and show that at least that psychic phenomena are true. They're real things. Well, that comes out of the esoteric tradition, and that's saying that there's something about the esoteric ideas, including consciousness is fundamental, where we need to pay serious attention to it, because it's not just stories, it's something real, and it can be studied. So I use the term real magic as partially as simply a way to attract people to the book, because what it really is about, the book, is about worldviews and philosophy and evidence and so on. But if I cast it in those terms, nobody would want to pick up the book.
Well, it definitely is compelling. It's a great title. And I think that a lot of people want a little bit of magic in their lives. And as we keep discussing this, I think people will find how you can bring magic to your own life. And so how would you define what magic is, so our audience can understand? I mean, we've talked about psychic phenomena. I think most people understand what that is. How would you describe what magic is?
I will do that, but first I wanted to answer the second part of your previous question, which is, well, why was it suppressed?
Okay.
Or why has it been pushed out onto the fringe and only can appear in entertainment? So I would guess that for about 8,000 years, it wasn't suppressed. It was the worldview that everyone had. So starting roughly 2,000 years ago with the rise of monotheism and the development of churches of various stripes, the church very rapidly became a powerful force in society. It became the arbiter of truth. It became the equivalent of politics and government and military, it all kind of wrapped into one. And what the founders of the churches found is that there were lots of independent groups out there and people with pagan ideas and which were considered heretical. And the moment that you're creating an organization that goes beyond what the mystics said, and creating an organization, a big organization, that you have to be involved in social control. So the pagans, the Druids, the Gnostics, on and on, they were deeply involved in the esoteric worldview, which was not matching very well. I'll use the example of Catholicism, but you can use other examples too. The Catholic Church did not like the idea that there were people who had different beliefs because it was a challenge to their authority. And so they basically and simply came up with the idea that anybody practicing magic that is not within the bounds of the church is heretical. And that's where you start getting assignments of it's demonic, it's witches who need to be burned for their beliefs and so on. So an enormous amount of pressure came from the religious side. And then starting around 400 years ago when science began, there was a lot of pressure from science too, to say this is not that it's heretical, but that it doesn't match this new worldview. And so we will exclude it. So you have both from religion and science, both saying that anybody who's doing these kinds of magical practices are pushed out of the mainstream. And the combination of 2,000 years from religion and 400 or 500 years from science completely pushed it away from the idea that this is real, but it is real. In which case, where does it show up? Well, and now it shows up as a multi-billion-dollar entertainment. That, of course, there are still many people who practice neo-paganism who are involved in ceremonial magic, but it's not mainstream by any means.
Right, so our collective consciousness, our collective unconscious is manifesting it in the entertainment world. Fascinating. Okay.
So now to answer your second question, so what is magic? So magic, if you go through the whole history, it comes out into three different kinds of practices. So you have the practice of divination. The divination means to perceive through space and time. A modern term might be intuition, except that intuition has multiple meanings. So intuition doesn't necessarily mean perceiving through space and time. The usual definition is that intuition means that you know something without knowing how you know it. And some of that might be through divination, some of it might be through forgotten knowledge or other means. So common practices are tarot cards and the runes and I Ching and mirror gazing and so on. So that's one practice that goes all the way back to shamanism. A second practice is force of will, which is the idea of that your intention can manipulate the world in ways to manifest what you wish. The typical way that is practiced in the modern times is through prayer. Now, prayer is not usually thought of as a magical practice, but actually it is exactly a magical practice, because any kind of prayer that involves intention, especially intention on the behalf, like intercessory prayer, that is explicitly a magical practice. And then related to that is the third category of practice called theurgy, which is getting spirits to do things on your behalf. So again, intercessory prayer is theurgy. So you find a lot of magical practices still engaged in the present world, but they have in different contexts, different words and so on, but that's what the practices have been.
Great summary. Yeah, and there's each one of those topics could be and have been its own book or volumes of books. So, and I think it's fascinating because in religions, it's like it's simultaneously practiced, but also preached, or some religions, and then also simultaneously preached against. I don't know if you have...
it's practiced within the religious context. Like a priest can do the ceremony of the Eucharist. A person who is not a priest is not supposed to do that. Mm-hmm. So there are prescribed rules about who is allowed to do what.
Yes, yes. And if we can, since we're on the topic of prayer and blessing, move to many people do bless their food, bless their friends, send prayers and so forth, pray for each other, pray for themselves, pray for all sorts of things. Would you be willing to share a little bit about your blessed tea or chocolate experiment?
Right. And then there's a third one now, blessed plants or blessed
Oh,
water.
and blessed plants, of course,
Yeah.
yes.
So this is addressing what you were just saying, that a lot of people have as a practice to bless food or beverage with the idea that one kind of blessing is simply a matter of gratitude. So you can have gratitude for the animal who gave the food or the plant or the water, whatever. The other part of it, though, is that you're blessing that you are thanking God or whatever for the opportunity to have this food and maybe improving the food at the same time. So when I go
Infusing
to,
it with some magic, as it were.
yeah, the blessing is I'm about to eat this salad. I hope it's not full of salmonella, that kind of thing. Or I wish this to really be healthy now. So we tested that, and this is where science really shines. There are methods that you can use to test anything that you're clever enough to figure out. So ours is a very simple test. Initially with chocolate, we got a big batch of chocolate from the same location, and we recruited people to participate in it, that they would eat chocolate 3 days of 1 week, and we would measure their mood at the end of each day. So some of the chocolate was partitioned out, and we had a Mongolian shaman and 3 Buddhist monks bless the chocolate so that anybody who ate that chocolate would have an elevation in their mood. And then so we, under double-blind conditions, we distributed the chocolate. Some people got the blessed chocolate, some people got the unblessed chocolate. We recorded their mood, and at the end of the study, we found that people eating the blessed chocolate had elevated mood. So we thought, well, that's pretty good. I mean, it's kind of along the lines of what we were expecting to see if blessing did anything. And so the next one we did was at a Buddhist foundation in Taiwan. We used tea rather than chocolate because I guess chocolate is not as popular in Asia as it is in the Western world, and tea is very popular. So we had a oolong tea made into a giant batch, and we separated it into 2 bins. We recruited 100 people 200 people, 100 of whom would get the blessed tea, blessed by the Buddhist monks, and the others would get an anti-blessed tea. What I mean by that is because we started from 1 batch of tea and we separated it, we wanted to avoid the possibility that if this batch was being blessed, that it would accidentally bless the other batch because they came from the same place. So we asked the monks to bless this one, but then to exclude the control so it would not be blessed. So they did that. So we did the same kind of design where we were measuring mood at the end of the day. And sure enough, again, we saw a significant difference in mood for people drinking the blessed tea. We also asked people, what did they think they were drinking? And this was to test the role of their belief in terms of the blessing effect. And so there we saw very, very strong effects, both statistically and even practically, a big effect. That if people in fact got the treated tea and they believe that they were, then you essentially are having a placebo addition. Your belief is amplifying the effect, and we got a very strong change in mood. But by contrast, people who got the same blessed tea but did not think that they were drinking blessed tea, no effect at all. So what this says is, and you see this in the magical lore again and again, that one of the strongest modulators of whether a magical practice will work is whether or not you believe in it. So if you don't believe in it, it seems as though you can simply stop it.
And when you do believe it, it sounds like your study found that it actually amplifies the magic of it. So not only do you get what is commonly referred to as the placebo, but then also a bump up, which is
Right.
really fascinating because a lot of times I've been championing integrative health for many years. A lot of the comments I receive back is it's just a placebo, or, there's not enough evidence to, beyond just that it might just simply be belief. And even Dr. Herb Benson, who you're probably familiar with, and others have been studying the power of belief. In fact, he has a whole data that shows that it can even affect all the way to the genetic level to help us with our health and wellness. On that comment about belief, can you share a little bit about the sheep and goats that you mentioned? And also, I really appreciated what you wrote in Supernormal. I believe it's on whatever page it's on in here, that a personality on page 90 can affect your personality type, can also affect your openness or belief into some of these phenomena.
Mm-hmm. So sheep and goats. Actually, I work at the Institute of Noetic Sciences in Northern California, where I live also. We periodically have sheep and goats come to eat all of the weeds around our property. It's a popular thing to do around here. So we have real sheep and real goats, which are fun to watch. But in an experimental context, the sheep are the believers and the goats are the disbelievers. So many experiments have been done over, almost 70 years now, 7 decades, where you'd get a classroom of students. You would ask them about their belief in ESP. You would separate them into 2 groups according to the degree of their belief. So you have sheep and goats in the same classroom. Give them the same ESP test, just some simple test, precognition or something, and they would predictably separate in terms of their performance according to whether they believed or disbelieved. So that became known as the sheep-goat paradigm. So there was a meta-analysis done recently looking at all of the experiments. I forget how many now, over 100 experiments of this type, and it's very, very clear that that effect is real. Belief modulates whether or not you get an effect. This is not too surprising from a psychological perspective because, as you already mentioned, that placebo is basically a matter of your belief and expectation. And if it can go in 2 directions, you can have placebo or nocebo, depending on whether you believe or don't believe. And sure enough, that will drive your actual experience. So in terms of personality, there are many different kinds of personality tests that have been applied to people against their performance in psi tests. One of the most robust predictors of performance besides belief is the psychological trait of openness. So people who are open to new experiences, to other people, are more tolerant about new ideas, they tend to do much, much better than people who are not so open. In terms of the Myers-Briggs category, the one of the 16 cells in the Myers-Briggs is a much, much higher level of belief is INFJ. Yeah, so I happen to be an INFJ. I didn't know that beforehand. Yeah, so of the 16 cells, that is the one where people are most open to things like intuition and psychic phenomena and so on. And of course, there's a flip side. There's a cell which is the complete opposite in Myers-Briggs terms, and those people think it's all nonsense because it is not part of their reality at all. So yes, there are personality differences in terms of belief, and belief tends to be correlated with actual experience.
And so also when I've been sharing evidence of some of these approaches, certainly, what we're talking about has definitely been on the fringe, but I think I know you're really helping to bring this back. How much research or personal experience do you think somebody needs in order to believe, and is it even necessary? I think that obviously my worldview, I want people to believe in this, but I also do need to respect that there are different ways of looking at things and there is value in that as well. But I think that, we all need to respect each other, hopefully, and not have some things that, like not having a paper accepted or having it retracted and so forth. So I'm just curious what your thoughts are on that.
If somebody is highly motivated to not believe, the only thing that will possibly make an effect is a personal experience. There's no amount of evidence will do anything. If somebody is inclined to believe, they actually don't even need evidence. They'll just believe it because they want to believe it. So in general, if you kind of ignore personality differences from the beginning, and say, well, what if you have a random person and you want them to accept these phenomena? The thing that does that always much stronger than anything else is a personal experience. So you can argue until blue in the face and show meta-analysis and statistics and whatever. That only works if you're at least neutral or inclined to think that there's something interesting. Otherwise, there's no hope.
Yeah. And it really does then beg the question around how are beliefs formed, which I know there's psychology, a whole branch of psychology in that as well. I'll have to check that out. So why would somebody want to develop their psi abilities or embrace magic?
A case could be made that for many people, it's not a good thing to go into these areas. And that's because, as you find even in meditation training, that somebody will go on a meditation retreat, like a 1-week meditation retreat where they may be meditating 5 or 6 hours a day. Roughly 2% of them will have a psychotic break. That there are certain personalities and certain psyches that are much more stable without having the idea that they can be open to the universe. It takes a certain kind of personality that's comfortable with that idea, because among other things, there's an enormous amount of ambiguity about it and uncertainty and risk at the same time. And some people can handle it and other people can't. They go off the deep end. So my sense is that if somebody is kind of drawn to these topics, they have experiences of them, they want to know, how can I improve my intuition? And there are lots of ways of very gently pushing people or training people. I usually recommend meditation as probably the easiest and simplest way of doing it. But there are training courses and lots of other things. The danger, again, is that we all come with a certain set of beliefs about the nature of reality. And for some people, this shatters that belief. Like if you have somebody who's quite skeptical beforehand, and now they do a little bit of remote viewing training, and they find that sure enough, they really can describe something that's far away, it shatters their belief. Because now they're thinking, what they will think is, everything that I previously thought is wrong. That's not the case. It's only like one tiny little thing is new to add on, but that's not the emotional impact. The emotional impact is, oh my God, everything I thought was true is wrong. And their personality, their belief structure shatters. This is a technique that's actually used in brainwashing. Like cults do this all the time. The cult leader might be slightly psychic and do something like a telepathic thing or whatever, and it will shatter the person's belief. And then once that happens, you can build them back up any way you want. So it's very important, I think, even for classes where you think everybody is quite stable, you never really know what's going on in somebody's psyche. But you teach somebody, first of all, not only how to open to these experiences, but how to close it again. You probably spend more time on closing it than opening it, because once you do one, you better know how to do the other. And the other thing is to say that this actually is not changing your worldview at all. This is expanding it a little bit. Everything else you knew is probably correct, but now it's just a little bit bigger. And it changes your sense of who you are a little bit. But that's why I caution people to not dive completely into something like this without also considering the risks involved.
Yeah, it makes me think of the training that I've done really does involve, and actually the way that I now teach as well, and I'm a big fan of Carl Jung, that we really do need to work with our own unconscious. And I mean, as you know, when you're working with psi phenomena, that you are accessing what we now refer to as the unconscious, which might really just be these other parts of ourselves we just don't, for whatever reason, have full access to. But that if we can, some will say, dissolving the ego, it's also personal development, working through different types of areas where we might, where things could get sticky, or we might have projection, or if something is very uncomfortable, that these things need to be taken slowly. I've trained several hundred people, and I have not yet encountered, although to be fair, the people who are coming to see me already have an interest in this. I'm not just working with the general public.
Mm-hmm.
So that would probably be a different sample, of course. But I haven't had any adverse reactions other than a few people who already had some type of quote pre-existing condition. I don't love to use pathological terms, but where that was affecting them, and so we just needed to be more careful. But I did find that even in those cases that it actually did enhance their life more than harm it. So
Mm-hmm.
but again, it was handled gingerly with myself and some other folks who were professionally working with them.
Yeah. So that I'm glad to hear that. So you're a professional trainer, you know what you're doing, and recognize that the effect that this can have on people. It also helps a lot that where you can pre-vet people, right? So if they need to do something like pay some money and go somewhere, and there's a pilgrimage to go to the place, and especially if the people who are interested in doing this are not trying to stop something that is disturbing them. I got a lot of emails from people saying, I'm being attacked by voices and stuff. Well, in those cases, I say, well, don't come to my workshop. You know, you need to go to a health professional who can help you deal with that first. And then after that's settled, well, then we can talk, because otherwise you're setting it up for major trouble.
Yeah, or simultaneously, right? But I think that makes sense. I know for me, I was having I was too open in a lot of cases. So you're right. I had to learn how to shut it down or how to have boundaries,
Right.
And that's also worked with the energetic system. Is I know we just have a few minutes left. Was there anything else you wanted to share about the benefits around? I know we talked about some of the, or if you have any evidence in your experience of sort of the general public as to how many people, just so we don't scare our listeners as to being open to some of these. What have you found a percentage of how many people tend to have adverse reactions in the general public?
Well, I can put it in a slightly different way. That we ran a survey to ask people of what kinds of experiences that they have personally had, to see, are we talking about a very small percentage of the population or large? We know a lot about what people believe, but not what they've actually experienced. So we had a subset of the general population, a random sample, and then of them, we got demographic information to see people who are professional scientists or engineers. So we can contrast the two. And so we developed a list of 25 different kinds of experiences that could be considered psychic. Everything from intuitive hunches and gut feelings all the way out to clairvoyance and seeing fairies and all kinds of just very broad range. So among the general public, 94% of the general public said that they had personally experienced at least one of the 25 different phenomena, and on average 8. So this is very, very popular. Yeah. So now our real question was, among scientists and engineers, who you would figure would be much lower percentages, 93% had experienced at least one of these phenomena, and on average 7. So this is very, very common. The vast majority of the population, regardless of what their profession happens to be, have experiences like this. Now, what they do with the experience is another issue. They might explain it away. They may ignore it. They may forget it at some point, although apparently not, because they did remember to say so in the questionnaire. Some families support the idea, some families don't. So we're dealing with very common experiences, which is one of the reasons why I think that people have become drawn to figuring out, well, I had that experience, it was amazing or weird or something, and they want to know more about it, and some percentage will then want to know, well, how can I use it better? Especially if the experience is one of something like, I had a precognition of something that unfolded which was true, and I wish I could get better at that because it could help save me and my family and many other people perhaps, because usually the precognitions are of not so nice things. The other is, I can feel a loved one at a distance who's having a problem or ill or something. And they know that because they can feel it or they perceive it in some way. That too would be very useful to have. And so any form of training that opens people to these phenomena especially if it gets under their control. Because what people are talking about in terms of their experiences are almost always spontaneous. They didn't plan for something to happen, it just happened, and they're amazed at it. So getting it under control requires a certain degree of training plus talent. Some people are naturally talented. The INFJ personality types probably have that talent. For people who are the complete opposite of that, the personality may not be talented, which is why they're a different personality. So some people can be trained. Actually, everybody can be trained to some extent. Some people will take it on much, much easier than others.
Yeah, and it makes me think of with your book Supernormal and how the yogis was practicing and studying the Yoga Sutras, the siddhis and samadhi, and other cultures, how really it seems that perhaps as these practices are coming over more into Western culture, that it seems that it's probable, I don't know if you'd agree with this, that it seems that we're really expanding our consciousness. And I'm a huge fan of meditation. It was what was taught to me and what I practice and what I teach people in order to access these realms and capabilities. And, you know, so that this is something that maybe, well, not maybe, but it would be wonderful if it could be taught in schools. I wish that intuition or this kind of information was taught like logic classes. I think that humanity would really be better off. And that's actually another question I had for you. You know, how do you feel that that practicing psi or our intuition or magic can benefit humanity, and especially now that we are facing really an ecological crisis or another, you know, period in our time on Earth? Wondering what thoughts you have on that.
Well, when faced with difficult decisions where there's not enough information to know what the right choice is, this is what people in politics are always faced with. And in the military and all, even our daily lives, we're always making decisions. If we had the ability to, in a sense, test the future, like sample different possible futures through precognition, as one example, and that would help us make a better decision, then we're almost bound. We must do that because it's a resource that we're not using. In which case, I'm completely in favor of training everybody that can possibly be trained, both to meditate, to open their awareness, which will allow them to make better decisions. I mean, it also has positive health consequences and lots of other things, but it just to name one thing about how do we navigate ourselves into a better future, the more people who have this sense of this is the right way to go as opposed to that way. If you're running blind, you're going to run blind right into the wall. If you're running with at least a little bit of vision, you have the opportunity to select a better future. So I'm completely in favor of more people meditating, more people learning about their intuition. Yes.
Let's do it. And I know that's seems to be a mission of IONS. Is that right? Yeah.
Yeah, it's part of the mission of IONS too.
So one last question, if that's okay.
Sure.
So how much do you feel we have our creators or co-creators of our own universe? How much, because it seems that intuition, as you mentioned, and that's something that I've certainly found to be true and why I'm such a huge fan of sharing this with as many people who are interested, is about gathering information and making the best possible choice that in my experience tends to play out in the best possible scenario for myself and all those concerned. How much do you feel that gathering information and intention, which is part of magic, do you feel that those are connected? How do you feel those might be connected?
Specifically with magic?
Well, with intention, because I feel like intuition seems to be about gathering information. Then there's the manifestation, you know, the law of attraction, right, the secret, and then there's intention where people want to create something. In my experience, I feel you need both, because if we try to intend something that really, again, this gets into belief system, I'll just, for lack of a better way of saying it, is not for our highest good and greatest joy or for those concerned, that, you know, how are we able to then how do you see gathering the information and then having that intention? Do you see that those seem to be, do those two seem to have a strong relationship in your experience?
Well, of course they do. Some people are much better at gathering information and others are much better at manifesting. So occasionally you'll find somebody who's very good on both sides. In my experience and what we see in the laboratory is that generally people tend to specialize, not intentionally, but they just, some are very naturally talented to get information. Others are much better at producing stuff. So what we're talking about now is collaboration. And even within magical practice, this was well known for many years that some people were really good at the ceremonial side and getting into altered states where you get information, and others are much better at putting it into play once they had the information. So yeah, they're deeply related. Anytime you want to do anything, you want to work with the best information that you can. So you draw information and then manifest.
Yeah, and it seems like as we are all aware that compassion and kindness is so important for humanity, and many psychologists understand, or people who work in mental or behavioral health, that how our relationship is with our inner selves affects how we treat others. And so if we can have a better relationship with ourselves, you know, through compassion, through meditation practices, and working through any, you know, inner angst or tension within ourselves, that we can then make better choices, not only for ourselves and others as well as we go forward. I know that we need to wrap up for time. Do you have any last thoughts or comments or anything else you want to share about what's next for you with as you have made these great contributions to science and to all of us?
Well, I'm still doing laboratory studies. I'm still writing. I'm still basically doing everything I've been doing for a long time. One thing I noticed that as I can see retirement in my future at some point, the anxiety associated with constantly working this problem is dissipating. So it's related to age. It's related to seeing that some things can be solved and other things cannot be solved so easily. So I'm a little bit less ambitious about what I think I can do at this point, and becoming much more interested in cultivating younger people who still have that kind of, anxiety is not quite the right word. It's more like power and wanting to push hard to solve problems. That's a younger person's game. So that's what I'm helping to support now.
Well, good for you. You've clearly already contributed so much, and it's making a difference. So thank you so much for the magic that you brought to all of our lives and for bringing us here together today. It certainly was very magical, is very magical for me to meet you, talk with you, and know you. And so please do check out Dean Radin at deanradin.org and read his books, Real Magic, Supernormal, The Conscious Universe, and Entangled Minds. And visit the Institute of Noetic Sciences at noetic.org, the Paranormal Psychological Association at parapsych.org, and Healing Connections podcast at holisticot.org, and we'll also be getting this podcast up onto another podcast platform.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you so much, Dean.
Thank
Blessings
you.
to everybody.